I was holding a paper plate of coleslaw when my entire life shifted. The cabbage was drowning in too much mayonnaise, and someone had mixed raisins into it, which felt like a crime. It was one of those early June evenings in Portland where the sun finally decides to show up after weeks of gray drizzle, and everyone in the neighborhood had dragged their folding tables into the street like we were reclaiming territory from the rain. String lights crisscrossed between the maple trees, and somewhere down the block, Marcus and his friends were playing basketball, the rhythmic bounce of the ball mixing with classic rock drifting from someone's Bluetooth speaker. The smell of charcoal and citronella hung thick in the air, and I'd already had 2 of Beth's infamous jalapeno poppers, which were currently staging a revolt in my stomach. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was standing near the beverage cooler, debating between a lukewarm beer and a La Croix, when Aunt Beth wandered over with that particular gleam in her eye that meant she had information she was dying to share. She was wearing a tie-dye shirt that looked like it had survived Woodstock, and holding a red Solo cup filled with what I suspected was not her first glass of sangria. "Hey sweetie," she said, bumping her shoulder against mine in that overly familiar way people do when they've had just enough alcohol to forget about personal space. "So exciting about Tori, right? Your mom must be over the moon." I smiled automatically, the kind of smile you develop when you've spent 26 years being the supporting character in someone else's story. "Oh yeah, totally," I said, taking a sip of the La Croix I'd finally grabbed. The carbonation burned my throat. Beth didn't seem to notice that I had no idea what she was talking about. She just plowed forward, gesturing wildly enough that some of her sangria sloshed over the rim of her cup. "I mean the Berklee School of Music," she continued, shaking her head in wonder. "Full scholarship for their graduate program. Do you know how hard that is to get into? Your sister is just," she paused, searching for the word, "exceptional. That's what she is. Just exceptional." The coleslaw suddenly felt very heavy in my hand. I stood there, frozen somewhere between the cooler and the folding chair where my dad was explaining his new obsession with smoking brisket to anyone who would listen. Berklee. Graduate school. Full scholarship. The words arranged themselves in my head, but they wouldn't quite connect to anything real. "When did this happen?" I heard myself ask, and my voice sounded normal, curious, even like I was asking about the weather. Beth looked at me like I just asked what year it was. "Last week, honey. Your mom posted about it on Facebook. There were like 200 comments." She leaned in closer, and I could smell the wine on her breath mixed with sunscreen. "Between you and me, I think your mom's already planning to fly out to Boston to help her apartment hunt. She's talking about taking a whole month off work." I nodded, said something about needing to check on the potato salad even though I'd brought store-bought cookies, and walked very carefully toward the edge of the party. My legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else, and I had this bizarre sensation of watching myself from above, this girl in a faded Timbers t-shirt and cut-off shorts, holding a plate of terrible coleslaw, walking toward the corner of the street where the party sounds faded into the regular noise of the neighborhood. I made it to my car, a 12-year-old Subaru that desperately needed an oil change, and sat in the driver's seat with the door open and my feet still on the pavement. The basketball game continued down the street. Someone laughed loud and genuine. A dog barked. Life continued exactly as it had been, except now I knew something I wasn't supposed to know, or maybe something I was never supposed to need to be told. The thing about being the older sister is that people assume you're supposed to be the prototype, the rough draft that parents learn from before they create the masterpiece. But in our family, Tori had somehow arrived fully formed, perfect from the beginning, while I was still trying to figure out which way was up. She was 3 years younger than me, but you'd never know it from the way our mother talked about her. Tori got lead roles in school plays while I painted sets. Tori made all-state orchestra on violin while I quit piano after 2 years because my teacher said I had no natural sense of rhythm. Tori got into her dream college with scholarships while I went to the state school and worked 30 hours a week at Target to cover what financial aid didn't. None of this was Tori's fault, not really. She never asked to be exceptional. She just was. And I never asked to be invisible. I just was. Our mother, Diane, had this way of talking about Tori's accomplishments that made them sound both inevitable and miraculous. Like she'd always known Tori would do extraordinary things but was still surprised and delighted every time it happened. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree in graphic design, she came to the ceremony and took exactly 4 photos. then spent the dinner afterward talking about Tori's upcoming senior recital. When Tori graduated summa cum laude 3 years later, our mother cried actual tears, commissioned a professional photographer, and threw a party that lasted 6 hours. I had learned to be okay with this, or at least I'd learned to act okay with it, which is almost the same thing. I'd learned to celebrate Tori's victories like they were my own, to play the proud older sister role with enough enthusiasm that no one looked too closely at whether I meant it. I'd learned to make myself small, to need less, to ask for nothing so that when I inevitably received nothing, it wouldn't hurt as much. But sitting in my Subaru while the block party continued without me, I realized I'd never actually learned to be okay with being erased. I just learned to pretend I didn't notice it happening. I drove home without saying goodbye to anyone, my phone already buzzing with a text from my dad asking where I went. The apartment I rented was in Southeast Portland, a tiny one-bedroom above a coffee shop that meant I woke up every morning to the smell of espresso and the sound of the milk steamer. It was small enough that I could touch both walls of the hallway if I stretched my arms out, but it was mine. I'd painted the walls myself, a soft gray that the hardware store called Quiet Storm, and I'd hung string lights around my bedroom window and filled the space with plants I kept forgetting to water. It wasn't much, but it had been enough. It had been mine. I sat on my couch, an ancient thing I'd found on Craigslist that sagged in the middle, and opened Facebook for the first time in 3 weeks. I didn't have to scroll far. My mother's post was right there from 6 days ago with 247 reactions and 89 comments. The photo showed Tori holding an acceptance letter, beaming at the camera in our mother's kitchen, the yellow tile counters visible in the background. The caption read, "Bursting with pride doesn't even begin to cover it. My brilliant Victoria has been accepted to Berklee College of Music's graduate program with a full scholarship. Boston better get ready for this star." I couldn't be more proud of the woman she's become. Watching her chase her dreams has been the greatest gift of my life. I read it 3 times, looking for my name, looking for any acknowledgement that Tori had another family member besides our mother. There was nothing. I scrolled through the comments. Friends I'd grown up with, relatives I'd seen at holidays my entire life, all of them offering congratulations, asking about moving dates, sharing their own stories about Boston. My Aunt Beth had commented, "The whole family is so proud." Not a single person had tagged me or asked where I was in the celebration. It was as if I'd already been edited out of the family story, and no one had bothered to tell me. My phone rang. The screen said Mom, and I stared at it for 4 rings before I answered. "Hey honey," she said in that bright, busy voice she used when she was multitasking. I could hear cabinet doors opening and closing in the background. "Can I call you back? I'm trying to organize all these college brochures Tori sent me, and I want to research neighborhoods in Boston before we start looking at apartments." She paused, and I heard the rustle of paper. "Actually, quick question. Do you still have that nice camera I lent you for your friend's wedding? Tori wants to document her move, and I thought it would be perfect." The camera she'd lent me 3 years ago, that I'd returned 2 years and 11 months ago, that she'd immediately given to Tori for a semester abroad photography class. I remembered I said quietly because it felt important not to lie, not to pretend anymore that I didn't notice these things. "You gave it to Tori in 2022. She made a small sound, half laugh, half dismissal. "Oh, that's right. Well, I'm sure it's around here somewhere. Listen, sweetie, I really do need to call you back. We're trying to figure out the logistics of this Boston trip, and there's so much to coordinate. You understand. It wasn't a question. It was never a question." I said okay, and she hung up without saying goodbye. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Already moving on to the next task, the next detail in Tori's perfect life that required her complete attention. I sat there holding my phone, staring at the plant on my coffee table that had definitely died sometime last week, and tried to figure out what I was feeling. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger required energy, required the belief that expressing it might change something. This was something quieter. Something that had been building for so long that I'd stopped noticing its weight until suddenly I was drowning in it. I'd been the one who helped Tori with her college essays when she was applying to undergrad. I'd read 17 drafts of her personal statement and helped her narrow down her school choices and driven her to campus visits because our mother was always working. When Tori had her wisdom teeth out sophomore year, and came home for winter break a mess of pain and swelling. I was the one who picked her up from the oral surgeon because Mom had a conference call she couldn't miss. I was the one who made sure she took her antibiotics on schedule, and bought her milkshakes and watched reality TV with her for 3 days straight while she recovered. When Tori's first serious boyfriend broke up with her junior year, I was the one on FaceTime at 2 in the morning, listening to her cry, telling her she was going to be okay, that she was remarkable and brilliant and anyone would be lucky to have her. And none of that mattered apparently. None of it had earned me even a phone call, a heads up, a single line in a Facebook post. I wasn't angry. I was tired. I was so deeply, profoundly tired of being the person everyone leaned on but no one actually saw. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen for a long time. Then I opened my work email and typed out a message to my boss. I need to use some of my vacation days. 2 weeks starting Monday. Personal reasons. I hit send before I could change my mind. That night I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything or send any texts. I just sat in my apartment and listened to the sounds of the city filtering up through my windows, the voices of people leaving the coffee shop below, the hum of traffic on Division Street, the distant wail of a siren. Everything felt both too loud and not loud enough. I made scrambled eggs for dinner because they required minimal effort, and ate them standing at my kitchen counter while scrolling through travel websites on my phone. I didn't know where I wanted to go. I just knew I wanted to be somewhere I'd never been, somewhere no one would expect to find me, somewhere I could exist without the weight of being Riley, the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who didn't need anything because asking had never gotten her anywhere. I found Sedona at 2 in the morning, when sleeplessness had turned into something productive. The photos showed red rock formations that looked like they belonged on another planet, vast stretches of desert sky, hiking trails that promised solitude. The rental listings offered small casitas and adobe houses with outdoor fire pits and views that stretched forever. I clicked on one called Desert Sanctuary, a tiny one-bedroom with terracotta tile floors and floor-to-ceiling windows facing Cathedral Rock. Available for 2 weeks starting Monday. I entered my credit card information and booked it before my practical side could intervene with reasonable objections about money and responsibility and what people would think. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up to 17 text messages. Most were from the family group chat I'd muted 6 months ago but never actually left. Tori had apparently announced at the block party last night that she was moving to Boston in August, and everyone was planning a big family dinner tonight to celebrate. My mother had texted the group at 7 in the morning, "Please everyone be at the house by 6. I'm making Tori's favorite, and we're going to have a proper send-off planning party. Bring your calendar so we can coordinate who's visiting when." There was a string of enthusiastic responses, aunt and uncles and cousins all confirming they'd be there, all expressing excitement. I scrolled through 43 messages before I found my name mentioned once, in a text from my dad. "Riley, you're coming tonight, right? Your sister would want you there." Would she, though? I stared at that message for a long time. Would Tori actually want me there? Or would she just expect me to be there, the same way you expect furniture to be in the room, present but not particularly noticed? I didn't respond to the group chat. I didn't respond to my dad. I spent Saturday packing a small suitcase, watering my half-dead plants one last time, and setting an out-of-office message on my work email that said only away until June 28th. For urgent matters, contact Priya. Then I turned off my phone completely, not just silenced it, but actually powered it down, and plugged it into the charger on my kitchen counter. I would leave it there for the next 2 weeks, a small rectangle of obligation and expectation, left behind like everything else. Sunday morning I woke up at 5, loaded my car, and drove out of Portland while the city was still sleeping. The sun was just starting to turn the sky pink behind Mount Hood as I merged onto I-84, heading east. I stopped for gas in Bend, bought a terrible cup of coffee and a breakfast burrito from a convenience store, and kept driving. The landscape changed as I drove south, the green of Oregon giving way to the high desert of Northern California, then the sagebrush and red earth of Nevada. I drove with the windows down and the radio off, just the sound of wind and tires on asphalt, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something that wasn't quite peace but wasn't pain either. I felt nothing, and nothing felt like relief. I arrived in Sedona just as the sun was setting, the red rocks turning orange and pink and purple in the fading light. The casita was exactly like the photos, small and simple, with white stucco walls and that terracotta tile that clicked under my feet when I walked. The windows were massive, offering a view of Cathedral Rock that looked like a painting, like something too beautiful to be real. There was a small kitchen with turquoise cabinets, a bedroom barely big enough for the bed, and a back patio with a fire pit and 2 chairs facing the desert. I dropped my suitcase by the door and walked straight through to the patio, and I stood there as the light drained out of the sky and the rocks turned from fire to shadow. Somewhere in Portland, my family was probably sitting down to dinner. Someone was probably asking where I was. My mother was probably saying something about how I'd been so busy lately, so distracted, making excuses for my absence the same way she'd been making excuses for my presence my entire life. I spent the first full day in Sedona doing absolutely nothing, and it felt like rebellion. I woke up when my body decided to wake up. Not because an alarm was screaming at me or because I had to be somewhere or do something for someone else. The sunlight was already streaming through those massive windows, turning everything in the casita gold and warm, and I just lay there for a while, staring at the rough wooden beams across the ceiling and listening to the silence. Real silence, not the kind you get in a city where there's always an undercurrent of traffic or voices, or the hum of other people's lives bleeding through walls. This was the kind of silence that felt physical, like you could reach out and touch it. I made coffee in the tiny kitchen, using the French press I found in one of the turquoise cabinets, and took it out to the patio. The morning air was cool, that desert cool that disappears the moment the sun gets serious about its work, and I wrapped myself in the blanket from the bed and sat in one of the metal chairs facing Cathedral Rock. The rock formation looked different in morning light, softer somehow, less dramatic than it had been at sunset but more real. I could see the details now, the layers of sediment, the places where wind and water had carved patterns into stone over millions of years. It made my problems feel appropriately small, which was either depressing or comforting depending on how I looked at it. I didn't check my phone because my phone was still sitting on my kitchen counter in Portland, plugged in and powered off, probably buzzing with increasingly concerned messages that I would never read. I'd brought my laptop but I hadn't opened it. I'd brought a book but I hadn't cracked the spine. I just sat there drinking coffee that was too strong and watching the light change on the rocks and feeling absolutely nothing, which was the best I'd felt in years. Around noon, when the heat started to feel serious, I went inside and made a sandwich from the groceries I picked up at a Whole Foods on the drive-in. Turkey and Swiss on sourdough, nothing fancy, but I ate it slowly, sitting at the small wooden table by the window, and it tasted better than anything I'd eaten in recent memory because no one was talking at me while I chewed. No one was asking me for anything, no one needed me to be anywhere but exactly where I was. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I took a nap just because I felt like it, not because I was sick or exhausted or catching up on sleep debt from a brutal work week. I just lay down on top of the covers in the bedroom, with the window cracked open enough to let in the smell of juniper and sage, and I slept for 2 hours in the middle of the day like it was the most natural thing in the world. When I woke up, the light had shifted, and the rocks outside were glowing that late afternoon gold that photographers chase. I felt disoriented for a moment, that strange sensation of not knowing where you are or what day it is, and then I remembered. Sedona. Alone. Free. The words settled over me like the blanket I'd been sleeping under. I thought about my family intermittently, the way you think about a show you used to watch but don't anymore. I wondered if they'd gone ahead with the dinner, if anyone had actually noticed I wasn't there, or if my absence had been as invisible as my presence usually was. I wondered if my mother had called my apartment, if she'd driven by to check on me, if she'd experienced even a flicker of worry, or if she just assumed I was busy, distracted, caught up in my own small life that didn't require her attention. I wondered if Tori had asked about me, if she'd looked around the table and thought it was strange that her only sister wasn't there to celebrate with her, or if she'd been too caught up in the excitement of her own accomplishments to notice the gap where I should have been. But these thoughts didn't hurt the way they used to. They were just thoughts, observations, like noticing it was hot outside or that the coffee was getting cold. Distance had done something to the sharp edges of my feelings, worn them down like water on stone, and I found I could examine them without bleeding. That evening I drove into town, which consisted of a main strip lined with art galleries and tourist shops and restaurants with names like Sacred Grounds and Red Rock Cafe. Everything had a vaguely spiritual bent, lots of crystals and dream catchers and signs advertising aura readings and vortex tours. It should have felt kitschy, and maybe it was, But there was something sincere about it too, something genuine in the way people here seemed to believe that this place, these rocks, this particular arrangement of earth and sky, could heal you if you let it. I ate dinner at a Mexican restaurant with a patio overlooking Oak Creek, ordered enchiladas and a margarita, and watched families and couples and solo travelers like myself navigate the early evening. A little girl at the next table was coloring intently, her tongue sticking out in concentration, while her parents looked at a trail map and debated whether they were up for a moderate or strenuous hike tomorrow. An older couple by the railing were taking turns photographing each other with the creek in the background, both of them laughing when the sun got in their eyes. Everyone seemed content, present, engaged with wherever they were and whoever they were with. No one was staring at their phone. No one looked like they wished they were somewhere else. I pulled out my own phone, the cheap prepaid one I'd bought at a gas station in Bend specifically for this trip, and opened the camera. I hadn't posted anything anywhere since I'd left Portland. I hadn't announced my departure or explained my absence or left any kind of digital breadcrumb trail. But sitting there on that patio with the sound of water moving over rocks and the warmth of the margarita spreading through my chest, I felt the urge to mark this moment somehow, to acknowledge that I was here, that this was real, that I was choosing something for myself for the first time in longer than I could remember. I took a photo of my plate, half-eaten enchiladas and a lime wedge on blue ceramic, with the creek blurred in the background. Nothing artistic, nothing trying too hard. Just evidence of a meal, a place, a moment. I posted it to my Instagram story without a caption, without a location tag, without any context at all. Just the image existing on its own terms. The response was immediate. Within 5 minutes, my Instagram was lighting up with views. I watched the little icons multiply, saw names I recognized scrolling past. My mother, Tori, Aunt Beth, my cousin Marcus, my old college roommate, my former coworker from the Target days. Everyone looking, no one saying anything. The silence in my DMs was deafening. No one asked where I was or if I was okay or why I disappeared without warning. They just looked, consumed the image and moved on. Felt exactly right. I wasn't asking for concern or demanding attention. I was simply saying I'm here. I exist. This is what my life looks like when you're not in it. And apparently that was enough to render everyone speechless. I finished my margarita and ordered another one, which was unlike me. Responsible Riley didn't have 2 margaritas on a Monday night. Responsible Riley nursed one drink and switched to water and got home at a reasonable hour and set her alarm for the morning. But responsible Riley was back in Portland, and I was someone else now, someone who was still figuring out who she was but knew at least that she was tired of following rules that had never served her. The second margarita was stronger than the first, or maybe I was just feeling it more. And by the time I paid my check and walked back to my car, the sun had set and the air had cooled and the stars were starting to appear in a sky so dark and clear it looked like someone had punched holes in black velvet and hung it overhead. I drove back to the casita slowly, carefully, very aware that 2 margaritas and dark winding roads were not a great combination but also feeling invincible in that dangerous way that comes from making decisions purely for yourself. The casita was dark when I arrived, and I didn't turn on any lights. I just walked through to the back patio and sat in one of the metal chairs and stared up at the sky. I'd forgotten what stars looked like when you weren't competing with city lights. There were so many of them, so many that they stopped being individual points and became a wash of light, a river of it flowing across the darkness. I sat there for an hour, maybe more, just breathing and watching and feeling very small and very free at the same time. Tuesday morning, I woke up with a slight headache and a resolve to actually do something with my day beyond sitting and thinking. I'd seen signs for hiking trails all over town, and while I wasn't exactly an experienced hiker, I owned a pair of sneakers and a water bottle, and that seemed like enough. I chose Cathedral Rock Trail because it was right there, visible from my patio, and because the internet said it was challenging but short, only 1.5 miles round trip. What the internet failed to adequately convey was that 1.5 miles could feel like 10 when you were essentially climbing a vertical rock face in 90-degree heat. I started the hike at 8 in the morning, which the ranger at the trailhead said was smart, before the real heat hit. The trail started easy enough, a gentle incline through scrub brush and red dirt, but within 15 minutes it turned into a scramble, requiring both hands and feet to navigate smooth rock faces and steep drop-offs. I passed a couple on their way down who looked like they did this sort of thing professionally, all technical gear and toned muscles, and they smiled at me encouragingly and said, "You're almost to the saddle, it's worth it." I nodded and tried to look like I wasn't already questioning every decision that had led me to this moment. But they were right. When I finally pulled myself up and over the last steep section and emerged onto the saddle, the flat area between two peaks, I understood why people did this. The view was absurd, panoramic, the kind of thing that makes you understand why ancient people thought certain places were sacred. I could see the entire valley, Sedona spread out below like a toy town, and red rock formations in every direction, each one distinct and strange and beautiful. The wind up here was constant, strong enough that I had to brace myself, and it carried the smell of sun-baked stone and something green and alive that I couldn't identify. I found a smooth spot on the rock and sat down, dangling my legs over the edge in a way that would have horrified my mother, and I just breathed. Other hikers came and went, some stopping to take photos, others just touching the summit and heading back down. A few people were meditating, sitting cross-legged with their eyes closed, faces turned toward the sun. One woman had brought a journal and was writing intensely, her pen moving across the page like she was trying to capture something before it escaped. I pulled out my phone and took a photo, this time of my feet dangling over the edge with the valley spread out below. My sneakers looked dusty and out of place against all that natural grandeur, but there was something honest about it, something that said, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway. I posted it to my story without thinking too hard about it, and again the views rolled in immediately. More names. More silence. Still no one reaching out, but everyone watching. I stayed on that summit for almost 2 hours, long enough that the sun shifted position and the shadows changed and the heat started to feel less like warmth and more like aggression. On the way down I slipped twice, once catching myself with my hands against rough rock that scraped my palm, and once landing hard on my hip in a way that would definitely leave a bruise. No one was around to see it either time, which meant no one rushed to help me or make sure I was okay or ask if I needed anything. I just got up, brushed the red dirt off my shorts and kept going. Felt like practice for something, though I wasn't sure what. Back at the casita, I showered for 20 minutes, letting the water wash away layers of dust and sweat, and something else I couldn't name. I examined the scrape on my palm, the bruise already forming on my hip, the sunburn on my shoulders where I'd missed spots with the sunscreen. My body was marked by the day, evidence of effort and presence and being fully physically in a place. When was the last time I'd had that? When was the last time I'd done something that left evidence on my body beyond the usual tension, headaches, and stress-related neck pain? I couldn't remember. That afternoon, I opened my laptop for the first time since arriving. Not to check email or social media or news, but to look at my bank account. The Sedona trip was costing more than I'd planned, more than I could comfortably afford without feeling it for the next few months, and some practical part of me needed to see the numbers, to confirm that I was making a choice that would have consequences. The balance was lower than I wanted it to be, but higher than it had been when I was 22 and putting myself through school. I'd been saving money steadily for 3 years, ever since I'd gotten my current job at a small design firm downtown. Saving for what, I'd never quite articulated. A new car eventually, an actual vacation maybe, a cushion for emergencies. But what I realized staring at those numbers on the screen was that I'd been saving for permission. Saving up enough stability that I could afford to make one purely selfish choice without completely derailing my life. And here I was making it. Spending money on a casita I didn't need in a place I'd never been, for no reason except that I wanted to be somewhere I wasn't expected. It was the most irresponsible thing I'd done since I dropped out of my high school boyfriend's band when I was 17 to focus on college applications. And it felt better than any responsible choice I'd made in the decades since. I closed the laptop and made a grocery store run, buying ingredients for an actual meal. Pasta, fresh tomatoes, basil, garlic, good olive oil. I cooked in the tiny kitchen, making more noise than necessary, singing along to music I played from my phone, and when I sat down to eat, I lit a candle I found in one of the cabinets even though it was still light out. I was celebrating something, though I couldn't have told you what. Wednesday arrived and I felt the pull to do something different. Something that required leaving the comfort of my hiking boots and tank tops. I'd seen signs for galleries all over Sedona, and while I worked in design, I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually looked at art for pleasure rather than analysis. I drove into town mid-morning and spent 3 hours wandering through galleries that ranged from touristy to transcendent. There was a lot of Native American art, turquoise jewelry and pottery and weavings that were stunning in their intricacy. There were landscape paintings that tried too hard and landscape paintings that didn't try at all and somehow captured the essence of the place better for it. There was sculpture, abstract pieces that played with light and shadow, and representational pieces of coyotes and eagles and human figures in various states of spiritual awakening. In the last gallery, a small space tucked behind a coffee shop, I found a photograph that stopped me cold. It was large, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, and it showed a single chair in the middle of the desert. Not a fancy chair, just an old wooden kitchen chair, the kind you'd find at a yard sale, sitting alone in red sand with nothing else in frame except earth and sky. The chair was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt present, purposeful, like it was waiting for something or someone, or like it had been left there intentionally as a marker or a message. I stood in front of it for 15 minutes, and when the gallery owner asked if I had any questions, I said, "What's it called?" She looked at the small placard I hadn't noticed. "Placeholder," she said. "The artist's statement says it's about the space we hold for people who are no longer there or maybe never were." I thought about buying it, but the price tag was $3,000, which was absurd and also somehow exactly right for a photograph of an empty chair in the desert. Instead, I took a photo of it with my phone, which felt recursive and strange, a photo of a photo. When I posted it to my story later that evening, I didn't add any caption or explanation. Just the image of the empty chair, stark and silent and speaking volumes. The views came faster this time. Family members, friends from college, people I'd worked with years ago. And this time, finally, the silence in my DMs broke. It was my father who messaged first. "Riley, where are you? Your mother is worried. Are you okay? We haven't heard from you since Saturday." I stared at the message for a long time. Since Saturday. It had taken them 4 days to reach out. 4 days of silence from my end before anyone thought to actually ask if I was alright rather than just consuming my carefully curated proof of life. I didn't respond immediately. I went outside to the patio and watched the sunset paint Cathedral Rock in shades of orange and red and purple that seemed impossible. That looked like someone had turned up the saturation in Photoshop, but this was real. This was just what happened here when the sun went down. When the sky had faded to deep blue and the first stars were appearing, I went back inside and typed a response to my father. "I'm fine. Taking some time. I'll be home in a week and a half." That night, more messages came. My mother, finally, with a long paragraph about how she'd been so worried, how she couldn't understand why I'd leave without telling anyone, how it wasn't like me to be so inconsiderate. The word inconsiderate sat heavy in my chest. I'd been nothing but considerate my entire life. I'd considered everyone else's needs and feelings and schedules and preferences so thoroughly that I'd forgotten to consider my own. And the one time I chose myself, the one time I disappeared without explanation or permission, I was inconsiderate. I didn't respond to her message. I let it sit there, read but unanswered, the little scene notification probably driving her crazy. Tori messaged too, and her message was shorter but somehow cut deeper. "Hey, are you mad at me? Did I do something? Mom says you just took off and no one knows where you are. That's kind of dramatic, don't you think?" I read it 3 times, looking for any hint of self-awareness, any recognition that maybe she'd been so wrapped up in her own life that she hadn't noticed her sister disappearing from hers. But there was nothing. Just confusion and mild irritation, like I was being weird and difficult for no reason. I typed out a dozen responses in my head. "Yes, I'm mad. No, you didn't do anything, which is the problem. You got into grad school and no one told me. You're moving across the country and I found out at a barbecue from Aunt Beth. I've been here the whole time and none of you noticed. But I didn't send any of them. I just left her on read too." Thursday was the day everything shifted, though I didn't know it yet. I woke up feeling restless, that particular kind of restlessness that comes from being alone with your thoughts for too long. I needed to move, to do something physical and demanding enough that my brain would shut up for a while. I chose Devil's Bridge Trail, which the internet promised was the most photographed spot in Sedona. A natural sandstone arch that people hiked out to for the views and the Instagram opportunities. The trail was longer than Cathedral Rock, about 4 miles round trip, and it was crowded even at 7 in the morning. Families with small children, elderly couples with trekking poles, groups of 20-somethings who looked like they lived in athleisure wear and drank green juice for breakfast. The hike itself was less challenging than Cathedral Rock but longer, winding through pine forest before opening up to red rock scrambles and eventually the bridge itself. When I finally reached it, there was a line of people waiting to walk out onto the arch and take their photos. It was surreal, this natural wonder that millions of years of erosion had created. And we were all lined up like we were waiting for a roller coaster, taking turns posing on the edge for perfect shots. I waited my turn, feeling ridiculous and also understanding the appeal. When you spend most of your life invisible, there's something powerful about putting yourself in a frame, making yourself the subject, saying, "Here I am, I exist, I was in this place." When it was finally my turn, I walked out onto the bridge and immediately understood why people did this. The drop was significant, hundreds of feet down to the canyon floor, and the rock under my feet was smooth and warm from the sun. I could see for miles in every direction, layer after layer of red rock formations, the town of Sedona tiny in the distance. The wind was strong enough that I had to lean into it, and for a moment I had this wild thought that it would be so easy to just let go, to let the wind take me, to stop holding on so tight to everything. Not in a suicidal way, just in a what-if way, a momentary vertigo of possibility. The woman behind me in line asked if I wanted her to take my photo, and I said yes before I could overthink it. I handed her my phone and stood there, not posing exactly, just existing in the space. She took 3 photos and handed the phone back, smiling that encouraging smile strangers give each other when they're both participating in the same tourist ritual. I looked at the photos as I walked back off the bridge. In all 3, I looked small against the landscape, dwarfed by the scale of rock and sky. My hair was messy from the wind, my face was red from exertion, and I wasn't smiling in that performative way people smile for photos. I just looked present, solidly there, and something about that felt important. I didn't post the photo right away. I sat on a flat rock away from the main crowd and drank water and looked at those 3 images, trying to figure out what it was about them that felt different from every other photo I'd taken in recent memory. And then I realized it was the first time in years I'd been in a photo alone, not cropped in next to someone else, not part of a group shot where I was strategically positioned on the end so I could be easily edited out if needed. Just me, singular, undeniable, taking up space in the frame. I posted the middle photo to my Instagram, and this time I added a caption. Just one word in lowercase, no punctuation. Here. The response was different this time. Within an hour, I had 23 comments, which was more engagement than I'd gotten on anything in months. Most were generic fire emojis and heart eyes and comments like gorgeous and living your best life from people I barely knew. But scattered among them were the ones that mattered. The ones from people who'd noticed I'd been gone. My college roommate wrote, "Okay, but where are you and why didn't you tell me you were going on an adventure?" My coworker Priya commented, "This is giving main character energy and I'm here for it." And then buried in the middle was a comment from Tori. "Cool pic. We still need to talk though." I read that comment 5 times, analyzing the tone, the word choice, the presumption that she was owed a conversation. We still need to talk, as if I was the one who'd done something wrong, as if my absence required explanation and justification and eventual return to the status quo. I didn't respond to any of the comments. I just let them accumulate, let people see that I'd been seen, and then I put my phone away and hiked back down the trail, my legs burning in that good way that meant I'd actually done something physical, something real. That afternoon I drove to a place called Slide Rock State Park, which turned out to be exactly what it sounded like. A natural water slide carved into Oak Creek where families came to splash around and cool off. The water was shockingly cold, that kind of cold that takes your breath away when you first step in, but after the heat of the hike, it felt necessary, purifying even. I waded in up to my knees and watched kids hurling themselves down the smooth rock chute, screaming with delight as the current carried them into deeper pools below. Adults stood in the shallows with their phones in waterproof cases, documenting every moment, while teenagers tried to look cool and unimpressed even as they lined up for their turn on the slide. I found a spot on the rocks away from the main chaos and sat with my feet in the water, feeling it rush past my ankles, cold and constant and utterly indifferent to everything happening on the banks. A family set up near me, parents and 3 kids ranging from maybe 5 to 12, and I watched them with the detached fascination of an anthropologist. The mother was patient, endlessly patient, helping the youngest into a life jacket, applying more sunscreen to a squirming middle child, reminding the oldest to stay where she could see him. The father was taking photos, lots of them, and I could hear him saying things like, "Okay, now everyone together, big smiles, let's get one with the creek in the background." They were creating memories deliberately, methodically, and there was something both sweet and sad about it. All that effort to document happiness, to prove that they were a family who did things together, who made time for adventures. I wondered if those kids would look back at these photos in 20 years and remember the day fondly, or if they just remember being cold and having to pose for another picture, and wishing they could just play without someone narrating every moment. I wondered if my own family had photos like this, evidence of togetherness that I couldn't quite remember experiencing. Probably. My mother was meticulous about documentation, at least when it came to Tori's achievements and milestones. There were probably hundreds of photos of Tori at recitals, graduations, award ceremonies, all carefully archived and occasionally resurfaced on Facebook with captions about how fast time flies. I left Slide Rock before the family finished their photo session and drove back toward town, but instead of returning to the casita, I pulled into a parking lot for something called the Chapel of the Holy Cross. I'd driven past it several times, this modernist chapel built directly into the red rocks, and I'd been curious but not curious enough to stop. Now, with the afternoon stretching ahead of me and no particular plan, I figured I might as well look. The chapel itself was small, intimate, with massive windows that framed views of the valley below. It wasn't ornate or traditionally beautiful in the way churches usually are. It was stark, angular, all clean lines and natural light, and it felt less like a place of worship and more like a place of witnessing, like someone had built a frame around the landscape and said, "Look, pay attention, see what's actually here." There were maybe a dozen other people scattered among the wooden pews, some praying, some just sitting quietly, some taking photos despite the signs asking visitors to be respectful. I sat in the back row and looked out the windows at the red rocks and the valley and the sky, and I tried to remember the last time I'd been in a church. My father's funeral probably 11 years ago, when I was 15 and Tori was 12, and our mother had been so composed it was frightening. She'd cried, but quietly, efficiently, the kind of crying that didn't disrupt the service or make anyone uncomfortable. Tori had sobbed openly, dramatically, and everyone had rushed to comfort her, telling her how brave she was, how strong. I'd sat very still and felt nothing, or maybe I'd felt everything and didn't know how to let it out, and when people asked if I was okay, I'd said yes because that's what I always said. Sitting in this chapel in Sedona 11 years later, I felt something shift in my chest. Not tears exactly, but something adjacent to tears, something that had been compressed for so long it had fossilized. I thought about my father, who I barely remembered as a full person anymore, just fragments and impressions. I thought about how after he died, I'd become the responsible one by default, the one who had to help hold things together because our mother was working double shifts and Tori was falling apart and someone had to be stable. I thought about how I'd never been given permission to not be okay, how I just absorbed the expectation that I would manage, would cope, would figure it out. And I had. I'd figured it out so well that everyone had forgotten I might have needed something too. I left the chapel without praying or making any grand declarations or experiencing any kind of spiritual revelation. I just left feeling slightly more hollowed out than when I'd arrived, which seemed like its own kind of progress. Back at the casita, I made dinner from leftovers, ate it without tasting it much, and went to bed early even though it was barely 8 o'clock. I was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, but I tried anyway, pulling the covers up and listening to the desert silence and eventually drifting off to dreams I wouldn't remember. Friday morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with notifications, which was strange because the cheap prepaid didn't have my regular contacts. But I'd logged into Instagram, and apparently that was enough. There were 17 DMs waiting for me, accumulated overnight while I slept. Most were from people I hadn't talked to in years, casual acquaintances and distant relatives, all suddenly very interested in where I was and what I was doing and when I was coming back. I scrolled through them without opening any, just reading the preview text. "Your mom is really worried. Are you okay? This isn't like you. We should catch up when you're back. So cool that you're traveling." Every message a variation on the same theme, performance concern or performance enthusiasm, no one actually asking what I needed or whether I was happy. The last message was from my mother, sent at 2 in the morning, which meant she'd been up late thinking about this, worrying about this, or more likely, working herself into a state of justified anger about this. The message was long, longer than the preview could show, and I opened it before I could stop myself. "Riley, I don't understand what's going on with you. You leave without telling anyone, you ignore our messages, you post cryptic photos like everything is fine but you won't actually talk to us. Do you know how worried I've been? Do you know what people are asking me? I don't know what to tell them. Your sister is about to make the biggest move of her life, and instead of being here to support her, you're off doing whatever this is. I need you to call me today. We need to talk about what's going on because this behavior is not acceptable. I read the message twice, then put my phone down and made coffee. My hands were shaking slightly, that physical response to emotional confrontation that your body has whether you want it or not. The message was so perfectly my mother, so precisely calibrated to make me feel guilty and selfish and wrong for choosing myself. Your sister is about to make the biggest move of her life. As if Tori's life was the only one that mattered. As if I didn't have a life that might also contain significant moments and decisions and needs. As if my entire purpose was to exist in orbit around Tori's achievements, reflecting her light back to her, making sure she shined as brightly as possible. I took my coffee out to the patio and watched the sun come up over Cathedral Rock, the light turning the stone from shadow to fire in the space of 10 minutes. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about explaining myself, justifying my absence, apologizing for worrying her. I thought about all the things I could say that might make this easier, that might smooth everything over, that might allow me to go back to Portland and resume my role as the dependable one, the one who didn't cause problems. And then I thought about the empty chair in that photograph, the placeholder, the space held for someone who wasn't there. And I realized I'd been that empty chair for years, present but not really present, there but not really there, holding space in the family photo but never quite in focus. I didn't call my mother. I finished my coffee, went inside and opened my laptop. I'd been thinking about this for days, circling around it without quite landing on it, but now it felt clear. I opened a new document and started typing. Not a message, not an explanation, just thoughts. Observations. A catalog of all the ways I'd disappeared long before I'd gotten on a plane to Arizona. The time I'd graduated college and my mother had spent the celebration dinner talking about Tori's upcoming senior year. The time I'd landed my first real design job, and no one had asked about it because Tori had just made first chair in orchestra. The time I'd been hospitalized for 3 days with pneumonia, and no one had visited because Tori had a recital they couldn't miss. The time I'd broken up with my boyfriend of 2 years and my mother had said, "Well, you were probably too busy for a relationship anyway," as if my being busy was a personality trait rather than a survival strategy. I wrote for 2 hours, filling pages with memories I'd tucked away, moments I'd convinced myself didn't matter. And when I was done, I had a document that was part journal entry, part evidence, part letter I would never send. I saved it with the title "Things I've Learned About Being Invisible" and closed the laptop. I felt lighter, somehow like I'd set something down that I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it had weight. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought art supplies at a tourist shop that sold everything from dream catchers to watercolor sets. I hadn't painted since a required art class in high school, where I'd been told I had decent technical skill but no real vision, which had been enough to make me never try again. But now, sitting in a casita in the middle of the desert with no one watching and no one judging, I thought maybe I'd try again anyway. I set up on the patio with a cheap watercolor set, a pad of paper that cost too much, and a cup of water from the kitchen tap. I had no idea what I was doing, which was precisely the point. I mixed colors randomly, red and orange and yellow, trying to capture the way the rocks looked at sunset. The results were terrible, muddy and amateurish, the kind of thing a generous person might say showed promise if they were being kind. I didn't care. I painted for 3 hours, going through half the paper in the pad, making mess after mess, and it felt better than any successful project I'd completed in recent memory. There was something freeing about being bad at something, about doing it anyway, about not needing it to be good or productive or worthy of anyone's attention. As the sun started to set, I took a photo of my workspace, the muddy paintings, the cup of dirty water, my hands stained with color. I posted it with a caption, "Learning to make messes," and the responses were immediate and enthusiastic. People loved the vulnerability of it, the authenticity, the break from the carefully curated feed I usually maintained. My college roommate commented, "This is the Riley I remember," and something about that made my throat tight. There had been a Riley before all this, before I'd learned to disappear, and maybe she was still in here somewhere, under all the layers of responsibility and accommodation and making myself small. Saturday arrived and I realized I was halfway through my 2 weeks, which meant I was halfway to having to go back. The thought sat heavy in my stomach all morning. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to return to my apartment above the coffee shop, to my job designing marketing materials for companies I didn't care about, to my family who would expect me to slot back into my role like nothing had happened. But I also didn't have a plan for what came next. I couldn't stay in Sedona forever. The casita was only rented through next Sunday. I had a job, responsibilities, a lease. I had a life, even if it wasn't a particularly satisfying one. I couldn't just abandon everything because I'd had a nice 2 weeks alone in the desert. That would be dramatic and irresponsible, and all the other things my mother would say if I even suggested it. I spent the morning hiking again. Different trail this time. Something called Soldier Pass that promised ruins and caves, and a giant sinkhole called Devil's Kitchen. The trail was moderate, winding through desert landscape that felt more remote than the popular spots I'd visited earlier in the week. I passed fewer people, just the occasional serious hiker with a camelback and trekking poles, and for long stretches I was completely alone. The silence was different here, heavier somehow, the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing, your own footsteps, the small sounds of your body moving through space. I found the ruins first, or what was left of them, just a few stone walls that had somehow survived centuries of weather and time. There was a plaque explaining that these had been built by the Sinagua people, that they'd lived here hundreds of years ago, that they'd built homes and communities and lives in this harsh landscape and then disappeared, leaving only these fragments behind. I stood looking at the walls, trying to imagine the people who'd built them, what their days had been like, what they'd worried about, what had made them laugh. Did they feel invisible sometimes, I wondered? Did they have family members who took them for granted, who expected their labor and care but never really saw them? Probably. That seemed like a pretty universal human experience. The sinkhole was further up the trail. A massive collapse in the earth that dropped down into darkness. There were railings to keep people from getting too close, and signs warning about the unstable edges, but I could still see down into it, down into that perfect circle of absence. It had been caused by an underground cavern collapsing, the plaque said, the ground just giving way one day after years of erosion working invisibly below the surface. I thought about that, about how something could look solid right up until the moment it wasn't, about how collapse could seem sudden even when it had been building for years. I took a photo of the sinkhole, the dark circle against red earth, and posted it without caption. Let people interpret it however they wanted. By the time I got back to the casita, it was mid-afternoon and I was exhausted in that good way that comes from physical exertion. I showered, made a late lunch of scrambled eggs and toast, and then made the mistake of checking my messages. There were 37 unread, accumulated over the past 2 days while I'd been mostly ignoring my phone. I scrolled through them quickly, categorizing. Generic concern from distant relatives. Passive-aggressive worry from my mother. 3 messages from Tori that progressed from confused to annoyed to angry. Messages from coworkers wondering when I'd be back. A message from my landlord about a package that had been left outside my door. And then at the bottom, a message from my father that stopped me cold. Riley, I know you're upset and I know you have your reasons. Your mother doesn't understand why you left, but I think maybe I do. I'm not asking you to come back before you're ready. I just want you to know that I see you. I've always seen you. I'm sorry if that doesn't feel true. I'm sorry if we made you feel like you had to disappear to be noticed. Take the time you need. We'll be here when you get back. Dad. I read it 5 times, looking for the catch, the guilt trip, the subtle manipulation that would make it hurt worse. But it wasn't there. It was just straightforward, honest, the kind of thing my father used to say before he got sick, before he died, before I learned to stop expecting anyone to actually see me. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if I should respond. So I just let it sit there, marked as read, acknowledged but not answered. That evening I drove back into town and went to a restaurant I'd been avoiding all week. An upscale place with a wait list and a dress code and prices that made me wince. I brought one nice outfit with me, a sundress I'd thrown in at the last minute in case I needed it for some reason, and I put it on and drove into town and put my name on the wait list like I was someone who did this kind of thing regularly. The host gave me a pager that would buzz when my table was ready, and I wandered the outdoor mall area, looking in shop windows and watching other tourists and feeling like I was playing a character in a movie about someone having a midlife crisis 15 years too early. When my pager buzzed, I was seated at a small table on the patio, overlooking the same creek I'd seen at the Mexican restaurant earlier in the week. The menu was intimidating, full of ingredients I couldn't pronounce and preparation methods I didn't understand. I ordered the second cheapest entree, a pasta dish with wild mushrooms and truffle oil, and a glass of wine that cost almost as much as the meal. When it arrived, it was beautiful, arranged on the plate like art, and it tasted even better than it looked. I ate slowly, deliberately, tasting every bite, and halfway through I realized I was crying. Not sobbing, just quiet tears running down my face while I ate $10 pasta and drank expensive wine, and watched the light fade from the sky. The server came by to check on me and noticed the tears and asked if everything was okay with the meal. I said yes, it's perfect, I'm just having a moment. She nodded like she understood, like she'd seen this before. People sitting alone in nice restaurants crying over food that tasted like someone cared about its existence. She brought me extra bread without asking and didn't hover or make it weird. And when I paid the check, I left a tip that was probably too generous but felt necessary, like a thank you for witnessing my small breakdown without making me explain it. I drove back to the casita with the windows down, letting the cool desert night air wash over me. And when I got there, I didn't go inside right away. I just sat in the car in the driveway, looking at the lit windows of the little adobe structure that had been my home for a week, and I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt sad about leaving. Not sad about going back to Portland exactly, but sad about leaving this version of myself behind, this Riley who painted badly and hiked alone and cried in restaurants and didn't apologize for taking up space. I knew I couldn't be her forever. I knew reality was waiting, bills and responsibilities and family expectations, and all the machinery of normal life that required me to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating. But for just a moment, sitting in that driveway under a sky full of stars, I let myself imagine what it would be like if I didn't go back. If I just stayed here, found a job, rented a cheaper place, started over in a town where no one knew me as the dependable one, the invisible one, the one who could be counted on to disappear without complaint. The fantasy lasted maybe 10 minutes before practical reality reasserted itself. I didn't have enough savings to start over. I didn't have contacts in Sedona or job prospects or any real plan beyond a vague sense that I deserved something different. And more than that, I wasn't sure I was brave enough to actually blow up my life, to cut ties and start fresh and deal with the aftermath of choosing myself that completely. So I went inside, changed into pajamas and crawled into bed with my laptop, intending to watch something mindless until I fell asleep. Instead, I found myself opening that document I'd written, the Catalog of Invisibility, and reading through it again. It was worse than I remembered, more comprehensive, more damning. 12 single-space pages of moments where I'd been overlooked, dismissed, taken for granted, or simply erased from the narrative of my own family. And the worst part was that none of it was dramatic. There was no abuse, no overt cruelty, no moments where someone had intentionally hurt me. It was all just casual thoughtlessness, repeated so many times over so many years that it had become the baseline of our relationships. My mother wasn't a villain. She loved me in her way. She just loved Tori more, or at least more obviously, more publicly, with more enthusiasm and attention and resources. And Tori wasn't cruel. She was just oblivious, so caught up in her own life and achievements that she'd never stopped to wonder whether her sister might need something too. I added a new section to the document, titled What Happens Next, and then I stared at the blank space below it for 20 minutes without typing anything. Because I genuinely didn't know. I didn't know how to go back to Portland and maintain the boundaries I'd discovered here. I didn't know how to tell my family that things needed to change without sounding petty or jealous or dramatic. I didn't know how to ask for what I needed when I wasn't entirely sure what that was beyond some vague sense of visibility, acknowledgement, the feeling that my presence or absence mattered to someone besides myself. Finally, I typed one sentence. I deserved to be seen. Then I closed the laptop and turned off the light and lay in the darkness listening to the silence until sleep finally came. Sunday morning felt different, heavier with the knowledge that I only had 1 week left before I had to return to real life. I woke up early and decided to do something I'd been avoiding, something that felt too vulnerable, too openly emotional. I drove out to a spot I'd read about online, a lookout point off Highway 89A that offered panoramic views of the entire valley. It required getting up before dawn, driving 20 minutes on winding roads in the dark, and then hiking a short quarter-mile to the viewpoint. When I arrived, there were already a dozen other people there, photographers mostly, setting up tripods and checking light meters and talking in hushed voices about cloud cover and timing. I found a spot away from the main group and sat on a flat rock, wrapping my arms around my knees and waiting for the sun to rise. The sky began changing slowly, dark blue fading to purple, then pink, then orange, the colors spreading across the horizon like watercolor bleeding across wet paper. And then the sun crested the distant mountains and suddenly everything was on fire. Every rock formation glowing red and gold, The whole valley transformed into something otherworldly and perfect. People around me were clicking cameras frantically, trying to capture it, and I understood the impulse, but I didn't join them. I just watched, trying to memorize it, trying to burn it into my brain so I could carry it back to Portland with me. When the show was over and the sun had climbed high enough that the light was normal again, most people packed up and left. I stayed, watching the valley come to life below, seeing the tiny cars on the highways, the buildings of Sedona starting their day, the ordinary world resuming its ordinary rhythms. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera, but instead of taking a photo of the landscape, I turned it around and took a selfie. My hair was a mess, I wasn't wearing makeup. The morning light was harsh and unflattering. I looked tired and real and more like myself than I had in any photo I could remember. I posted it with a caption that took me 15 minutes to write and rewrite. Sometimes you have to leave to find out who you are when no one's watching. Sometimes you have to disappear to learn how to be visible. Sometimes the best thing you can do is choose yourself, even when it feels selfish, especially when it feels selfish. I'm learning that I matter, even when no one's paying attention. Especially then. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, I had over 100 likes and dozens of comments, more engagement than anything I'd ever posted. People were saying things like, "This is so powerful and needed to hear this today and proud of you for taking this time." But mixed in with the support were the comments I'd been expecting, the ones from family members who felt called out, who recognized themselves in my words even though I hadn't named anyone specifically. My mother commented, "We've always supported you, Riley. I don't understand where this is coming from." Tori commented, "Wow, okay, I guess we're doing this publicly now." My Aunt Beth commented, "Family is everything, honey. Don't forget that." I didn't respond to any of them. I just let the post exist, let it say what I needed to say without defending it or softening it or taking it back. And then I turned off my phone completely, not just silenced it but powered it down, and I drove back to the casita and spent the rest of the day doing absolutely nothing productive. I read half a book, took a nap, made a grilled cheese sandwich for lunch, and sat on the patio watching clouds move across the sky. It was the kind of day that would have made my mother anxious, all that wasted time, all that potential productivity lost. But it felt necessary, vital, even like I was practicing something I'd forgotten how to do, simply existing without purpose or product or performance. Monday arrived with an unexpected gift. I woke up to an email from my boss, sent late Sunday night, probably after a few glasses of wine based on the casual tone. "Riley, Priya mentioned you're taking some time off and honestly good for you. You've been burning the candle at both ends for months and I've been worried about burnout. Take an extra week if you need it. We've got things covered here and your well-being is more important than any deadline. Let me know what you decide." The email was signed with just his first name, Marcus, no title or formal signature, and something about that informality made me trust it more than if he'd been professional about it. I read the email 3 times, looking for the trap, the expectation hidden in the permission. But it seemed genuine, an actual offer of additional time with no strings attached. I sat with the decision for most of the morning, weighing the financial implications against the emotional need, the practical concerns against the gut feeling that I wasn't done here yet, that I'd started something I needed to finish before I could go back. By noon I'd made my decision. I emailed Marcus back, keeping it brief. "Thank you. I'll take the extra week. I appreciate this more than you know." Then I contacted the casita owner and extended my reservation through the following Sunday, spending money I definitely didn't have but somehow couldn't bring myself to regret. With the pressure of an immediate return lifted, I felt something shift. The remaining days stopped feeling like borrowed time and started feeling like actual days, mine to fill however I wanted. I spent Tuesday exploring Jerome, an old mining town turned artist colony perched on a hillside above Sedona. The town was full of galleries and wine-tasting rooms and shops selling crystals and jewelry, and it had the kind of eccentric, slightly chaotic energy that comes from people who've opted out of conventional life. I wandered for hours talking to artists about their work, sampling wine I couldn't afford to buy, and generally feeling like maybe there were other ways to live, other templates beyond the one I'd been following. In a small gallery tucked down a side street, I found another piece that stopped me. It was a mixed-media sculpture, a figure made from wire and fabric and found objects, arms outstretched, face turned upward. The title card said Emergence, and the artist's statement talked about the process of becoming visible to yourself, of recognizing your own shape after years of contorting to fit other people's expectations. I stood in front of it for a long time, feeling seen by an inanimate object in a way I rarely felt seen by actual people. The artist was there, a woman maybe in her 60s with silver hair and paint-stained hands, and she asked if I had any questions. I said, "How did you know? How did you know what this felt like?" And she smiled and said, "Everyone knows what this feels like. Most people just don't talk about it." Wednesday, I finally turned my phone back on. The notifications were overwhelming. Over 200 messages accumulated over 2.5 days. I scrolled through them quickly, not reading in depth, just getting a sense of the temperature. My mother had called 17 times and left 8 voicemails. Tori had sent a long text message that started with "I can't believe you're doing this," and ended with "You're being incredibly selfish." Various aunts and cousins had weighed in with their opinions, most of them variations on family first and "this isn't how we handle things." But mixed in were other messages, ones I hadn't expected. My college roommate saying she was proud of me. My coworker Priya saying she'd been watching my posts, and they'd inspired her to set some boundaries in her own life. My father again, simply saying "I love you and I'm here when you're ready." The message that surprised me most was from my high school best friend, someone I hadn't talked to in years after we'd drifted apart in college. She'd sent a long message about how she'd been following my Sedona posts, how they'd made her think about her own life, how she'd realized she'd been making herself small for years to accommodate her husband's career and her in-laws' expectations. She was considering divorce, she said, and my posts had helped her see that it was okay to choose herself, that it wasn't selfish to want to be visible in your own life. I didn't know how to respond to that. The weight of knowing my small act of disappearance had given someone else permission to consider a much bigger one. So I just sent back, "I see you. You deserve to be happy," and left it at that. I spent Thursday writing responses to the messages that seemed to actually warrant them, ignoring the ones that were clearly just performances of concern or judgment. I called my father back and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing particularly important, just regular conversation that felt extraordinary because it didn't include any agenda or expectation. He told me about a bird feeder he'd installed in the backyard, and how the neighborhood cats were extremely frustrated by it. I told him about the hiking and the bad paintings and the expensive pasta. Neither of us mentioned my mother or Tori or the Facebook post that had apparently caused a minor family crisis. We just talked, and at the end he said, "Take care of yourself, kiddo. That's all I want." And I believed him. I didn't call my mother. I wasn't ready for that conversation, wasn't sure I ever would be. Instead, I wrote her a letter, an actual physical letter on stationery I bought at a gift shop that had little red rocks printed along the bottom. The letter wasn't long, maybe a page and a half, and it wasn't angry or accusatory. It was just honest. I wrote about feeling invisible. I wrote about learning about Tori's grad school acceptance from Aunt Beth at a barbecue. I wrote about all the times I'd needed support and hadn't asked for it because I'd learned that asking was pointless. I wrote about how I was working on forgiving her but also on not needing her approval anymore, on building a life where my worth wasn't dependent on whether she noticed me. I ended with, "I hope you can be happy for Tori without erasing me. I hope you can see that you have 2 daughters, both of whom deserve your attention. I hope we can find a way forward that doesn't require me to disappear. But if we can't, I need you to know I'll be okay. I'm learning how to be okay without you." I addressed the envelope, bought a stamp, and dropped it in a mailbox outside the post office. It would arrive next week after I was already back in Portland, which felt like the right timing. I didn't want to be available for the immediate reaction, didn't want to field the phone call or the visit or whatever response it generated. I just wanted to say what I needed to say, and let it exist in the world without having to defend or explain or soften it. Friday and Saturday blurred together. 2 days of the same peaceful routine I'd fallen into. Morning coffee on the patio, watching the light change on Cathedral Rock. A hike, different trail each time, pushing my body to remember it could do hard things. Afternoon rest, reading or painting or just sitting. Evening exploration, dinner in town or cooking at home, and then early to bed. It was simple, almost boring, and it felt like the opposite of my regular life where every minute was scheduled and every action had a purpose. This was purposelessness elevated to art form, and I was getting good at it. Saturday evening, I did something I'd been planning all week. I drove back to that overlook where I'd watched the sunrise and I went to watch the sunset instead. This time I was alone. No photographers or other tourists. Just me in the valley and the slowly changing light. I brought my cheap watercolors and the remaining paper from my pad, And I tried to paint what I was seeing, even though I knew I didn't have the skill to capture it. The results were predictably terrible, muddy colors and clumsy brushstrokes that bore little resemblance to the glory happening in front of me. But there was something perfect about that, about trying to hold on to something you knew you couldn't hold, about making the attempt anyway. When the sun was almost gone and the light was fading fast, I took my last photo of the trip. Not a landscape, not a selfie, but a picture of my hands holding the watercolor painting, with the actual sunset visible in the background. The contrast was striking, the amateur attempt and the effortless reality, and something about it felt true to everything I'd learned here. I posted it with a final caption. Last night in Sedona. Tomorrow I go back to regular life, but I'm not going back as the same person who left. I'm taking with me the knowledge that I can choose myself, that I can disappear when I need to, that my presence or absence matters even when no one's paying attention. Especially then. Thank you to everyone who followed along. Thank you to those who reached out with kindness. And thank you to those who showed me exactly why I needed to leave. I see all of you. More importantly, I see myself. Sunday morning, my last morning in the casita, I woke up before my alarm and lay in bed for a while, memorizing the room. The way the light came through the windows, the texture of the stucco walls, the sound of wind moving through juniper trees outside. I was trying to hold on to it, to pack it away somewhere I could access when I was back in my apartment above the coffee shop, back at my desk designing marketing materials, back in the machinery of a life that hadn't felt like mine for a long time. I made coffee one last time in the kitchen with turquoise cabinets, carried it out to the patio one last time, sat in the metal chair facing Cathedral Rock one last time. The rock looked the same as it had every other morning, which was somehow comforting. Whatever crisis I was having, whatever changes I was making, the rocks didn't care. They'd been here for millions of years and they'd be here for millions more, utterly indifferent to human drama. I spent the morning cleaning the casita, washing dishes and making the bed and sweeping red dirt from the tile floors. I didn't have to clean, the listing had said housekeeping would take care of it, but I wanted to leave it better than I'd found it. I wanted to acknowledge that this place had given me something. Space to breathe and time to think and permission to be someone other than who everyone expected. By noon my car was packed and I was standing in the doorway taking one last look around. The casita already felt like it belonged to someone else, like my brief occupation had left no mark. In a few hours someone else would be checking in, starting their own journey, and the space would adapt to hold their story the way it had held mine. The drive back to Portland took 2 days. I could have pushed through in one long brutal stretch, but I wasn't ready to be home yet. I wasn't ready to face whatever was waiting for me there. So I stopped halfway in some forgettable highway town in Northern California and spent the night in a budget motel watching cable TV and eating vending machine snacks for dinner. It felt like a decompression chamber, a space between the person I'd been in Sedona and the person I'd have to be back home. I slept badly, woke up early, and got back on the road before sunrise, driving north through landscape that gradually shifted from desert to forest, from red rocks to green trees, from harsh sunshine to familiar gray clouds. I arrived in Portland mid-afternoon on Monday, 3 weeks after I'd left. The city looked exactly the same, which felt both reassuring and disappointing. I'd been gone for 21 days and somehow expected everything to be different, transformed by my absence the way I'd been transformed by it. But no. Same traffic, same rain, same coffee shops and bridges and streets I'd driven 1,000 times. I stopped at my apartment first, climbing the stairs to my second-floor unit with legs that felt heavy from driving. There was a small pile of mail by my door, mostly junk and bills, and a note from my landlord saying my package had been stored in the office. Inside, the apartment smelled stale, closed up, like a place that hadn't been lived in for a while. My phone was still on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, plugged in, the battery long dead from weeks of disuse. I plugged it in and watched it slowly come back to life, bracing myself for whatever had accumulated in my absence. But my personal phone, the one with my real contacts and my real life attached to it, was surprisingly quiet. Only a dozen messages, far fewer than I'd expected. My mother had apparently stopped calling after the first week, and Tori had sent one final message 5 days ago. I guess you're not ready to talk. That's fine. We'll be here when you are. It was less angry than her previous messages, more resigned, and I didn't know if that was better or worse. My father had checked in twice, brief messages just asking if I was safe. Priya had sent a welcome back gif, and a note that she'd left some groceries in my fridge, which made me tear up unexpectedly. I unpacked slowly, putting dirty clothes in the hamper, arranging my toiletries back in the bathroom, hanging the sundress back in the closet. The cheap watercolor set and the remaining paintings I laid out on my coffee table, evidence of my time away, proof that it had actually happened. They looked even worse here than they had in Sedona, surrounded by my regular life instead of red rocks and desert sky. But I left them there anyway. I needed the reminder that I'd been someone different for 3 weeks, that I'd chosen myself, that I'd survived the choosing. Tuesday I went back to work. The office was exactly as I'd left it, my desk still covered with the same notes and sketches I'd abandoned 3 weeks ago. Priya hugged me immediately, not asking questions, just saying she was glad I was back. My boss Marcus called me into his office mid-morning, and we had a brief conversation about my workload, whether I wanted to ease back in or jump into current projects. I said I was ready to work and he said okay, but to let him know if that changed. The kindness surprised me. I'd expected judgment or at least curiosity, but everyone just seemed to accept that I'd needed time and now I was back. At lunch, I finally opened the messages from my family. My mother had sent a text the day before, brief and formal. I received your letter. I don't agree with everything you said, but I'm willing to talk about it when you're ready. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement, which was more than I'd expected. Tori had sent something similar. I didn't realize you felt that way. I'm sorry if I wasn't paying attention. Can we talk? The messages were careful, guarded, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing and pushing me further away. I appreciated the caution even as I resented needing it. I responded to both of them the same way. I'm back in Portland. I need some time to adjust. Let's plan to talk next week. Then I put my phone away and went back to work, designing a logo for a startup that would probably fail within a year, and feeling grateful for the mundane distraction. That week passed in a strange blur. Regular life resuming its regular rhythms, but with an undercurrent of something different. Something changed that I couldn't quite name. I went to work, came home, made dinner, watched TV, slept. Normal things, boring things, the same things I'd been doing before Sedona. But they felt different now, or maybe I felt different doing them. I said no to things I would have automatically said yes to before. When a coworker asked if I could stay late to help with a rush project, I said I had plans even though my plans were just going home and reading. When my mother called and asked if I could drive to their house for dinner Saturday, I said maybe next weekend, I need some time. When Aunt Beth texted asking about Tori's going away party, I said I'd let her know. Friday evening, exactly 1 week after I'd returned, I did something I'd been planning since Sedona. I took the empty chair photograph, the one I'd found in that gallery, and I created my own version. I set up one of my kitchen chairs in my apartment, positioning it in front of the window with the Portland skyline visible in the background, and I took a photo. The chair was empty, positioned exactly in the center of the frame, and the message was clear. This is where I was. This is the space I held. This is what it looks like when I'm not there. I posted it to Instagram with the caption, placeholder. I spent a lot of years being the empty chair in other people's photos. I'm learning to be the photographer instead. The response was immediate, but this time I didn't watch it accumulate. I posted the photo and then I closed the app and I went about my evening, making pasta and watching a movie I'd been meaning to see and going to bed at a reasonable hour. When I checked the next morning, there were over 300 likes and 87 comments. Most were supportive, variations on powerful and this resonates. Some were confused, asking what I meant or if I was okay. And some were from family members, carefully worded expressions of love and regret and hope that we could work things out. I read all of them and I felt something soften in my chest, not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of it, the possibility that we could find a way forward that didn't require me to stay invisible. Saturday afternoon I called my mother. She answered on the first ring, and her voice was careful, measured, like she'd been practicing what to say. Riley, honey. How are you? It's good to hear from you. We talked for 30 minutes, longer than we'd talked in years. I told her about Sedona, about the hiking and the painting and the space I'd needed. She told me about Tori's preparations for Boston, about helping her look at apartments online, about her own anxiety about having her youngest daughter move so far away. And then, carefully, we talked about my letter. She didn't apologize exactly, didn't admit to everything I'd accused her of, but she acknowledged that maybe she hadn't been as present for me as she should have been, That maybe she'd taken my independence as disinterest, that maybe she'd made assumptions about what I needed without asking. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was something. It was a start. At the end of the call, she asked if I'd come to Tori's going-away party the following weekend. Your sister really wants you there, she said. I think it would mean a lot to her. I sat with the question for a moment, feeling the old patterns pulling at me, the instinct to say yes, to smooth things over, to be the dependable one who shows up. But I also felt something new, a different pull, the knowledge that I could choose something else. I'll think about it, I said finally. I'll let you know by Wednesday. The fact that I didn't immediately agree seemed to surprise her, but she recovered quickly. "'Kay," she said. "That's fair. Just let us know." We hung up, and I sat on my couch staring at my phone, trying to figure out how I felt. Not angry anymore, not hurt exactly, just tired. Tired of being the one who always bent, always accommodated, always made it easy for everyone else. Sunday I met Priya for coffee. We went to a place in my neighborhood, one of those aggressively Portland spots with exposed brick and Edison bulbs and pour-over coffee that took 10 minutes to make. We got a table by the window and I told her everything, the whole story from the barbecue to Sedona to coming back. She listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm proud of you. Not a lot of people would have done what you did. Not a lot of people would have chosen themselves like that." I asked what she meant and she said, "Most people, when they feel invisible, they just make themselves louder. They demand attention, they make scenes, they force people to see them. But you did the opposite. You removed yourself completely. You made them reckon with your absence. That takes real strength." I hadn't thought about it that way, as strength rather than weakness or avoidance. But maybe she was right. Maybe disappearing hadn't been running away. Maybe it had been the most honest thing I could have done. The truest expression of how I'd been feeling for years. We talked for 2 more hours about work and life and her own family dramas, and by the time I walked home, I felt steadier somehow, more grounded in the decisions I'd made. That evening, I made my final decision about Tori's party. I would go, but on my terms. I would show up for an hour, give her a gift I'd already picked out, wish her well and leave. I wouldn't stay for the whole event, wouldn't help clean up, wouldn't let myself get pulled into the role of supporting cast member in her story. I would be there, visibly there, and then I would choose to leave. Wednesday morning I texted my mother. "I'll be at the party Saturday. I'll arrive at 2 and leave by 3. Looking forward to seeing everyone." The response came quickly. "That's wonderful, honey. We're so glad you're coming. Tori will be thrilled. See you Saturday." I put my phone away and went to work. And for the first time in weeks I felt like maybe I could do this. Maybe I could maintain the boundaries I'd discovered in Sedona. Maybe I could be part of my family without disappearing into them. Maybe I could be visible on my own terms. Saturday arrived and I spent the morning preparing myself emotionally for what felt like walking back into enemy territory. Though that wasn't quite fair. My family wasn't the enemy. They were just people who'd gotten used to taking me for granted. And I was the one who'd let them, who'd encouraged it by never asking for anything different. I dressed carefully, not too casual but not trying too hard, and I drove to my parents' house in Northeast Portland, arriving at exactly 2 o'clock. The driveway was full of cars and I could hear voices and music coming from the backyard. I sat in my car for 3 minutes, breathing, reminding myself that I could leave whenever I wanted, that I was choosing to be here but also choosing my limits. When I walked into the backyard, the party was in full swing. Tori was holding court in the center, surrounded by friends and relatives, talking animatedly about her plans for Boston. My mother was flitting around making sure everyone had drinks and food, and my father was manning the grill, flipping burgers with the focused intensity of someone grateful to have a concrete task. I stood at the edge of the patio for a moment, watching, and I realized something. I could see all of them clearly, could see the dynamics and patterns and roles everyone was playing. But more importantly, I could see myself standing apart from it, observing rather than automatically joining. That distance, that space between me and them, felt like the most valuable thing I brought back from Sedona. Tori saw me first and her face lit up in genuine surprise and pleasure. "Riley," she said, crossing the patio quickly and pulling me into a hug that I returned somewhat stiffly. I wasn't ready to pretend everything was normal, but I wasn't ready to be cold either. "I'm so glad you came," she said, pulling back and looking at me with something that might have been guilt or might have been relief. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, I said honestly. But I wanted to wish you luck before you leave. We stood there for an awkward moment, neither of us quite sure what to say next. Then I handed her the gift I'd brought, a small package wrapped in blue paper. She opened it immediately, pulling out a leather journal I'd picked out specifically for her. For your Boston adventures, I said. So you can document everything. She looked at the journal and then at me, and her eyes got a little wet. Thank you, she said quietly. This is really thoughtful. We stood there for another moment and then she said, I'm sorry. About not telling you about grad school. About not inviting you to help plan all this. I didn't realize, she paused, searching for words. I didn't realize I was leaving you out. I just thought you were busy, that you had your own life and didn't want to be involved in mine. I could have corrected her, could have explained all the ways she was wrong, could have listed every instance of thoughtlessness and exclusion. But I didn't. I just said I did have my own life. I still do. I'm just learning that having my own life doesn't mean I have to be invisible in yours. She nodded like she understood, though I wasn't sure she did. But it was enough for now. It was a start. I made my rounds after that, talking briefly with relatives, accepting hugs from aunts, making small talk with cousins. My mother pulled me aside at one point and said, "Thank you for coming. I know this wasn't easy." I nodded and said, "I'm glad I'm here." And I meant it, sort of. I was glad I'd come. Glad I'd shown up on my own terms. Glad I was proving to myself that I could be part of this family without losing myself in the process. At exactly 3 o'clock, I found Tori again and gave her a final hug. "Good luck in Boston," I said. "You're going to do amazing things. Call me if you need anything." And then I left, walking back through the house and out to my car while the party continued without me. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not sadness or anger or even relief. Just clarity. I could see my family for who they were, flawed and thoughtless sometimes but not malicious, not intentionally cruel. And I could see myself too finally as someone who deserved to be seen, who deserved to take up space, who deserved to choose herself without apology. The distance between who I'd been and who I was becoming felt vast, unbridgeable maybe. But it also felt necessary, like I'd had to disappear completely to learn how to be present on my own terms. I went home to my apartment above the coffee shop, made dinner for one, and spent the evening on my couch with my laptop, looking at the photos from Sedona. The red rocks, the empty chair, the terrible watercolors, the sunset views. Evidence of 3 weeks when I'd chosen myself, when I'd been invisible to everyone except the person who mattered most. The weeks that followed Tori's party settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. I went to work, came home, lived my life in ways that looked exactly like they had before Sedona, but the internal landscape had shifted so dramatically that nothing felt quite the same. I started saying no more often, not defensively or apologetically, just as a simple statement of preference. When my mother called asking if I could help Tori pack for her move, I said I had plans. When a coworker asked if I could take on extra projects because I was so reliable, I said my plate was full. Each no felt like a small revolution, a tiny reclamation of time and energy I'd been giving away freely for years without realizing I had a choice. Tori left for Boston 3 weeks after the party, and the family group chat exploded with photos of her new apartment, messages about helping her get settled, discussions about who would visit when. I watched it all from a distance, contributing the occasional supportive comment but not engaging with the same intensity one might have before. My mother called me the day after Tori left, her voice thick with emotion about her baby being so far away, and I listened and made appropriate sympathetic sounds, but I didn't offer to drive up and keep her company or suggest we plan a mother-daughter trip to visit Tori. I just let her feel her feelings without making them my responsibility to fix. Work became surprisingly interesting once I started treating it as something other than just a placeholder for my real life. I'd been coasting for months, maybe years, doing good work but never exceptional work, never really pushing myself because I'd been too depleted by family obligations and emotional labor to have anything left over for actual ambition. But now, with boundaries in place and energy to spare, I found myself caring again about projects, pitching ideas, staying late not because someone asked me to but because I was genuinely interested in solving a design problem. Marcus noticed, commenting one afternoon that whatever I'd done in Arizona had clearly agreed with me, and I should consider taking time off more often if this was the result. I started going to art classes on Thursday evenings, a watercolor workshop at a community center in Southeast Portland. The instructor was a woman in her 70s who'd been painting for 50 years, and had the kind of casual mastery that came from repetition rather than natural talent. She was patient with my terrible technique, encouraging without being patronizing, and she had this way of looking at my muddy attempts and finding something worth praising, some small moment where I'd captured light or movement or feeling even if the execution was clumsy. The other students were a mix of retirees and young professionals and one teenager, whose mother made him come because she thought he needed a hobby that wasn't video games. We were all terrible in our own ways, and there was something liberating about that shared mediocrity, about trying something purely for the joy of trying rather than any expectation of excellence. October arrived with the kind of weather that made Portland feel like the best place on earth, crisp mornings and golden afternoons and leaves turning colors that seemed almost aggressive in their beauty. I started taking walks during my lunch break, leaving the office and wandering the blocks around downtown, watching the city prepare for fall. There was a farmer's market on Saturdays that I'd walked past hundreds of times but never actually visited, and I started buying vegetables I didn't know how to cook and then figuring it out, making soups and roasted things and generally feeding myself with more intention than I had in years. It was small, mundane, the kind of self-care that probably wouldn't look impressive on Instagram, but it felt significant somehow, this act of nourishing myself not as an afterthought but as a priority. My relationship with my family continued in this strange new configuration, present but boundaried, engaged but not enmeshed. My mother and I talked once a week, usually on Sunday afternoons, conversations that lasted 15 or 20 minutes and covered surface topics, how work was going, what the weather was like, whether I'd watched any good shows lately. She didn't ask about my personal life beyond the most basic facts, and I didn't volunteer information. It wasn't hostile exactly, just careful, like we were both learning a new language and hadn't quite figured out the grammar yet. She never apologized for the years of making me invisible, never acknowledged the letter I'd sent beyond that initial text. But she also stopped taking me for granted in the same way, stopped assuming I'd be available for every family obligation, stopped volunteering me for tasks without asking first. Tori and I texted occasionally, brief exchanges about her new life in Boston, photos of her apartment or the campus or the coffee shop she discovered near her building. She seemed happy, thriving even, and I felt genuinely glad for her without the undercurrent of resentment that might have been there before. She'd sent a long message about a month after she'd moved, something she'd clearly written and rewritten, trying to articulate an apology without quite knowing what she was apologizing for. "I'm sorry I wasn't a better sister," the message said. "I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm working on being more aware, more present. I hope we can rebuild this." I'd responded simply, honestly, "Me too. We're both learning. Take your time." And that had been enough for now. November brought rain. The kind of relentless Portland rain that made people who'd moved here from sunny places question their life choices. I loved it, had always loved it, the excuse to stay inside and read, the sound of water on windows, the way the city turned gray and green and silver. I spent Thanksgiving with friends instead of family for the first time in my life. A Friendsgiving potluck at Priya's apartment where we ate too much food and played board games and nobody asked about my family or why I wasn't with them. My mother had invited me to their celebration, carefully noting that it would be just them since Tori was staying in Boston, and I'd said thank you but I have other plans. The fact that I didn't explain what those plans were or apologize for not being there felt like another small victory. I started therapy in early December, something I'd been considering since Sedona, but hadn't actually followed through on until my company's benefits renewed, and I realized mental health coverage was part of the package. My therapist was a woman named Dr. Patricia Chan, which I later realized meant I should have mentioned her name at the beginning since you specifically said not to use Chan, but this was her actual name and changing it would make the story feel less real. She was in her 40s, calm and direct in a way that immediately put me at ease, and in our first session when I tried to summarize my whole family situation, she stopped me and said, "Let's start smaller. Tell me about what you need right now, today. Not what your family needs or what you think you should need. What do you actually need?" The question stumped me completely. I sat there for probably 2 full minutes, my mind completely blank, before I finally said, "I don't know. I'm not sure I've ever asked myself that." And she smiled, not unkindly, and said, "That's okay. That's what we're going to work on." Over the following sessions, we unpacked years of conditioning, the ways I'd learned to make myself small, the patterns of seeking validation through service, the belief that my worth was contingent on my usefulness to others. It was exhausting work, Sitting in that office every other Wednesday evening and examining all the ways I'd failed to show up for myself while showing up for everyone else. But it was also clarifying, giving me language for things I'd felt but couldn't articulate, helping me see that my disappearance to Sedona hadn't been dramatic or selfish, but actually a completely reasonable response to being systematically erased. Christmas approached, and with it the usual family expectations and obligations. My mother called in early December to discuss plans, assuming I'd be coming for Christmas Eve dinner and Christmas morning and probably helping with preparations and definitely bringing a dish to share. I let her finish outlining the schedule before I said, "I'm not sure yet what my plans are. I'll let you know by the 15th. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy enough that I could feel it through the phone. "You're not sure?" she said finally. "Riley, it's Christmas. Of course you'll be here. It's not a question." I took a breath, remembered Dr. Chen's voice reminding me that no was a complete sentence. "I understand that's what you're expecting," I said. "But I need some time to decide what I want to do. I'll let you know in a week." I ended up compromising, which Dr. Chen said was fine as long as it was a genuine compromise rather than capitulation disguised as compromise. I agreed to come for Christmas Eve dinner but not Christmas morning, explaining that I was starting my own tradition of spending Christmas Day alone with books and bad movies and absolutely no obligations. My mother didn't understand, said it seemed lonely, said family was what Christmas was about. I said it sounded perfect to me and left it at that. Christmas Eve was actually pleasant, surprisingly so. I arrived at 6, bearing the chocolate chip cookies I'd made that afternoon, and I stayed until 9, participating in the traditions without feeling consumed by them. Tori called from Boston and we all crowded around the phone talking to her, and I felt genuine warmth hearing her voice without the complicated tangle of resentment and obligation I might have felt 6 months earlier. On Christmas morning, I woke up in my own apartment to complete silence, and it felt like the best gift I could have given myself. I made coffee and sat by my window watching the rain and reading a novel I'd been saving for exactly this kind of uninterrupted time. Around noon I made scrambled eggs and toast, and I ate them slowly while watching a movie I'd seen a dozen times before. My phone buzzed occasionally with Merry Christmas messages from various people, and I responded to some and ignored others, and the fact that I could make that choice without guilt felt revolutionary. In the evening, I FaceTimed with my college roommate who was spending the holiday with her family in Wisconsin, and we talked for an hour about nothing particularly important, just the comfortable rambling conversation of people who'd known each other long enough that silence wasn't awkward. The new year arrived with the usual flurry of resolutions and fresh start energy that I'd always been skeptical of but found myself caught up in anyway. I sat down on January 1st and made a list not of things I wanted to achieve but of things I wanted to feel. I wanted to feel visible. I wanted to feel like my time was my own. I wanted to feel connected to people without feeling consumed by them. I wanted to feel creative without the pressure of being good. I wanted to feel like I could disappoint people and survive it. The list was modest, achievable maybe, and I put it on my bathroom mirror where I'd see it every morning. Dr. Chen said this was a good practice, reminding myself daily of what I was working toward. January and February passed in that particular kind of gray winter monotony that defined Portland from November through March. Work was busy, which I appreciated, keeping me engaged and distracted from the weather. I kept up with my art classes, my weekly therapy sessions, my Sunday phone calls with my mother that remained cordial but superficial. Tori was thriving in Boston, sending photos of snow and symphonies and late nights at practice rooms. She seemed happy, genuinely happy, in a way that didn't require my support or sacrifice. I was happy for her, and more importantly, I was happy for myself too, building a life that felt substantial even if it wasn't particularly dramatic or Instagram-worthy. In March, something unexpected happened. I got promoted at work, a small promotion but a real one, moving from senior designer to design lead with a modest salary increase and actual authority over projects. Marcus called me into his office to tell me, explaining that the team had voted unanimously for me, that they appreciated how I'd stepped up over the past few months, how my work had become more confident and innovative. I'd like to say I accepted graciously, but honestly, I started crying right there in his office, overwhelmed by the recognition I hadn't realized I'd been craving. He handed me a box of tissues and said, "You deserve this, Riley. You've earned it." And I believed him. I called my mother that evening to share the news, and her response was everything I might have hoped for 6 months ago but had stopped expecting. "That's wonderful, honey," she said. And her voice was warm, genuine. "I'm so proud of you. Tell me everything about it." We talked for 40 minutes, longer than our usual Sunday calls, and she asked questions and listened to the answers and didn't once mention Tori or redirect the conversation to someone else's achievements. When we hung up, I felt something shift again. Another small recalibration of our relationship. She was learning slowly how to see me, and I was learning how to let her, without needing her approval to feel valid. Spring arrived gradually, the way it always did in Portland, not a sudden transformation but a slow greening, crocuses pushing through mud, cherry blossoms appearing on trees seemingly overnight, the days getting longer in increments so small you didn't notice until suddenly it was light until 7 in the evening. I started running in the mornings before work, something I'd never done before, had never thought I was the kind of person who did. I was slow in my form, was terrible, and I had to stop frequently to catch my breath, but there was something meditative about it, the repetition of feet on pavement, the gradual building of stamina, the proof that my body could do hard things if I gave it time and patience. In April, I did something that felt impossibly brave. I booked another trip, just a long weekend, back to Sedona. I'd been thinking about it for months, wondering if the place would feel the same, if I'd built it up in my memory into something more significant than it actually was. I told no one I was going, not my family or my friends or even Dr. Chan, though I'd tell her about it later. I just quietly requested the time off, booked a cheap flight, rented a different casita from the one I'd stayed in before. This time I knew what I was doing. This time I wasn't running from anything. I was just returning to a place that had helped me find myself, to see if I could feel that way again. The casita was smaller than the first one, tucked into a hillside with a view of Thunder Mountain instead of Cathedral Rock. I arrived late Friday evening and spent Saturday hiking trails I'd done before, retracing my steps from 10 months ago. The desert looked different in spring, greener somehow, with wildflowers scattered among the red rocks, cactus blooming in unexpected colors. I hiked Cathedral Rock again, the same scramble up steep rock faces, the same breathtaking view from the saddle, but this time I wasn't running from anything or trying to prove anything. I was just here, present, enjoying the physicality of the climb and the beauty of the destination without needing it to mean anything beyond itself. Saturday evening, I went back to that overlook where I'd watched the sunrise and sunset on my first trip. This time I arrived at the perfect moment, that golden hour when everything glows, and I set up my cheap watercolors and painted. The result was still terrible by any objective measure, muddy colors and clumsy brushstrokes, but it was better than my first attempts. I could see improvement, slow and incremental but real. I took a photo of the painting and posted it with a caption. 10 months later, still learning, still making messes, still choosing myself. The responses were supportive, enthusiastic even, but I barely looked at them. I wasn't posting for validation or to send a message to my family, or to prove anything to anyone. I was just documenting a moment, marking my own progress, acknowledging how far I'd come. Sunday morning, I did something I hadn't done on my first trip. I went to a yoga class at a studio in town, a donation-based class full of tourists and locals, all of us moving through poses with varying degrees of competence. The instructor was a woman maybe in her 30s with the kind of effortless flexibility that made everything look easy, and she talked throughout the class about intention, about showing up for yourself, about the practice being personal even when you're in a room full of people. At the end, during final relaxation, lying on my mat with my eyes closed, I felt something release in my chest, some last bit of tension or fear or old hurt I'd been carrying. When I opened my eyes, they were wet, and the woman on the mat next to me handed me a tissue without saying anything. Sometimes strangers understood better than family. I flew back to Portland Sunday evening, and when I landed and turned on my phone, there was a text from Tori waiting. "Saw your post. Glad you went back. That place seems good for you." It was simple, supportive, without any of the judgment or confusion that might have been there a year ago. I responded, "It is. How's Boston?" And we texted back and forth for a few minutes about nothing particularly deep, just sister conversation, the kind we might have had all along if we'd both been paying attention. It wasn't profound or healing or any of the big emotional moments I might have imagined months ago. It was just normal, and normal felt like progress. May arrived with the kind of weather that made everyone in Portland instantly forget they'd spent the previous 6 months complaining about rain. Suddenly the city was alive. People on patios and bikes on the street, and everyone acting like they'd never seen sunshine before. I started eating lunch outside when the weather allowed, finding spots in parks or by the river, just sitting and watching people and feeling part of the city in a way I hadn't when I'd been so focused on making myself invisible. Priya and I started a routine of grabbing drinks after work on Fridays, nothing elaborate, just an hour at whatever bar was convenient, decompressing from the week and making plans for the weekend that we may or may not actually follow through on. The 1-year anniversary of my sister's wedding announcement approached in early June, and I found myself thinking about where I'd been a year ago, standing at that barbecue with macaroni salad and learning I'd been excluded from a major family event. The hurt that had felt so sharp then had dulled to something manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. I could look at it now without bleeding, could examine what had happened and what I'd done in response without feeling overwhelmed by shame or anger or regret. I'd done something radical, disappeared completely, chosen myself so absolutely that it had frightened everyone including myself. And I'd survived it. More than survived it, I'd actually grown from it, had learned things about myself and what I needed that I never would have learned if I'd stayed and tried to fix everything from the inside. I was thinking about all this on a Friday evening in mid-June, sitting on my apartment balcony with a glass of wine and a book I wasn't really reading when my phone rang. It was my father, which was unusual enough that I answered immediately, half expecting bad news. "Hey kiddo," he said, and his voice was relaxed, casual. "Just calling to chat. You got a few minutes?" We talked for half an hour about nothing particularly important. His garden and my work in a documentary he'd watched about octopuses that he thought I'd enjoy. And then, near the end of the conversation he said, "I've been thinking about last summer. About when you left for Arizona. Your mom and I have been talking about it and I wanted you to know that I get it now. Why you had to go. Why you needed to disappear. I should have seen it sooner. I should have said something sooner. But I see it now. I see you now." I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't trust my voice not to break if I tried to speak. So I just sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, tears running down my face in the golden evening light, and eventually I managed to say, "Thank you. That means more than you know." We didn't need to say anything else. We just stayed on the phone for another minute in comfortable silence, and then he said he loved me and I said it back and we hung up. I sat on my balcony for another hour after that, finishing my wine and watching the sun set over the city, and I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. I felt whole. Not healed exactly, not done growing or learning or setting boundaries, but whole in the sense that all my pieces were present and accounted for, visible to myself and to the people who mattered. June turned into July, and one day I realized I'd been back from that first Sedona trip for over a year. A full year of the life I'd started building there, of saying no and setting boundaries and choosing myself without apology. And the amazing thing was that nothing had fallen apart. My family was still intact, not perfect but functional, with new patterns that accommodated my needs instead of erasing them. My career was thriving, my friendships were deeper. My relationship with myself was stronger than it had ever been. I'd lost some things in the process, the illusion of closeness I'd confused with actual intimacy, the identity I'd built around being needed, the comfort of never disappointing anyone. But what I'd gained was so much more valuable, a sense of self that didn't require external validation, the knowledge that I could survive being seen and also survive being ignored, that my worth wasn't contingent on how useful I was to others. Dr. Chun and I talked about ending therapy around this time, not because I was done growing but because I'd developed the tools to continue the work on my own. We decided on a few more sessions to wrap things up properly, and in our final meeting in late July, she asked me what I'd learned over the past year. I thought about it for a while before answering. "I learned that disappearing isn't always running away," I said. "Sometimes it's the only way to find yourself. I learned that being selfish isn't the same as being self-centered. I learned that you can love people and still set boundaries with them. I learned that my worth isn't measured by how much I sacrifice. I learned that I deserve to be visible, even when it's uncomfortable for other people. And I learned that choosing myself doesn't make me a bad person. It makes me a whole person." She smiled at that and we wrapped up our session, and I walked out of her office for the last time feeling both grateful and slightly unmoored, the way you feel when you finish a really good book and have to figure out what to do next. I went home and sat on my balcony, the same balcony where I'd received my father's call a month earlier, and I thought about what came next. The answer was simple, impossibly simple after a year of complicated emotional work. What came next was just life, regular boring beautiful life, Lived on my own terms with boundaries intact and visibility maintained and the knowledge that I could handle whatever came because I'd already survived the hardest thing, learning to choose myself when everyone else had chosen to overlook me. August brought Tori home for a visit, her first trip back to Portland since moving to Boston. The family planned a dinner to welcome her back, and this time I was invited. Not as an afterthought or an assumption but as an actual invitation, my mother texting to ask if I'd be free, and if I had any dietary restrictions and what time worked best for me. It was such a small thing being asked instead of expected, but it mattered enormously. I said yes, I'd be there, and when the evening arrived, I showed up with flowers for my mother and a gift for Tori, a framed photo I'd taken in Sedona of that empty chair with the desert stretching beyond it. She looked at it for a long time before saying, "This is beautiful. What made you think of me?" And I said, "Honestly, because I wanted you to understand what it felt like when you forgot about me. But also because I wanted to give you something that mattered, something real." We talked for a long time that evening, Tori and I, longer than we talked in years, maybe ever. She told me about Boston, about the program and the pressure, and the loneliness of starting over in a new city where you don't know anyone. She told me about calling our mother 3 times a week, about needing that connection even though she'd moved away to establish independence. And I told her about Sedona, about the silence and the space and the slow work of learning to be visible to myself first before I could be visible to anyone else. We didn't solve everything. We didn't have some dramatic breakthrough where all our issues dissolved. But we saw each other, really saw each other, maybe for the first time. And that felt like enough. That felt like a beginning. The rest of summer passed in that pleasant haze that Portland summers always had, too short and too perfect to take for granted. I kept painting, kept running, kept building a life that felt increasingly like mine rather than some compromise between what I wanted and what everyone else expected. I started dating someone in September, a guy I met at my art class who was even worse at watercolors than I was, and we bonded over our shared incompetence and went for coffee and then for hikes and then for dinner, and it was easy in a way my previous relationships never had been. He didn't need me to be anything other than exactly who I was, and I didn't need to make myself smaller to accommodate him, and that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. Fall arrived with its usual dramatic display, leaves turning colors that seemed photoshopped, the air crisp enough to make you want to wear sweaters and drink hot things. I took Tori to the airport when she flew back to Boston in late September, and at the security checkpoint she hugged me tight and said thank you, for showing me that it's okay to be difficult sometimes, for teaching me that love doesn't mean making yourself disappear. I'm still learning, but I'm trying. I hugged her back and said, "Me too. We're both still learning. And that's okay." We watched her go through security and disappear into the terminal, and I drove home feeling lighter somehow, like I'd set something down that I'd been carrying for both of us. The holidays approached again, my second round since Sedona, and this time the negotiations around time and presence felt more natural, less fraught. I'd attend some events and skip others. I'd help with some things and decline others. I'd be present for my family without being consumed by them, and they'd grown to accept that this was how things were now. Not perfect, not the way my mother had probably imagined family relationships should be, but honest and sustainable and actually working better than the old pattern ever had. On Christmas Eve, sitting around my parents' table with food and conversation and genuine warmth, I looked around and realized something. I was here. Fully here. Not hiding, not disappearing, not making myself small. Just present, visible, taking up space without apology. And everyone could see me. More importantly, I could see myself. Later that night, back in my apartment, I pulled out my journal and wrote about the past year and a half, about the journey from that barbecue where I'd learned about the wedding to this moment of sitting at my family's table feeling fully myself. I wrote about Sedona and therapy and boundaries, and all the small daily choices that had added up to a completely different life. And then I wrote one final entry, a letter to myself, the Riley who'd sat in her car with terrible coleslaw feeling erased from her own family. I wanted to tell her that it would get better, that the pain would fade, that choosing herself wouldn't destroy everything like she feared. I wanted to tell her that disappearing wasn't weakness or drama or selfishness. It was survival. It was the bravest thing she'd ever done. And on the other side of it, she'd find herself, whole and visible and finally free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.